Recording. I was just going to say, let's go ahead and get that recording going. I'm Heddy Lahmann. I'm the Senior Managing Editor and the Program Director for the Journal on Education and Emergencies. We're thrilled that you're here to join us to launch this special issue on gender and education and emergencies. This event provides a preview of the exciting content featured in the publication. We'll hear brief presentations from authors representing each of the research articles and the field note. Please visit the journal website and read their terrific articles in full, and you can find those links in the chat. So because we have a packed agenda, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Dana Burde, JEiE's Editor-in-Chief. So Dana Burde is an associate professor and Director of International Education at NYU's Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science, and Humanities, and associated faculty at NYU's Politics Department, as well as the Center for Practice and Research at the intersection of information, society, and methodology. Her research focuses on education and political violence and has been funded by a number of domestic and international funders. Her book, Schools for Conflict or for Peace in Afghanistan, won the 2017 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. So without further ado, Dana, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Heddy. It is terrific to be here this morning. I'm so excited to see this issue come to fruition. It's been a long time coming, or it feels like it's been a long time coming, because we were in the midst of the pandemic when we realized that we were writing about gender and education emergencies, and suddenly women were taking full-time responsibility all over the world for the care of their small children, as they were also trying to do their full-time jobs. So we were very, the issues at hand were very much present in our minds as we were carrying out this special issue. This is the official launch on the Journal on Education and Emergencies special issue on gender and education and emergencies, volume 8, number 2. And I'm going to briefly introduce a representative from our parent organization, the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies. They're also the publisher of the journal, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about our work at the journal. Excuse me. Many of you know about the Journal on Education Emergencies, but what you may not realize is that we maintain an entirely open access model of publication, while at the same time adhering to rigorous academic standards. What this means is that the contents of the journal are accessible for free to all readers everywhere, and we do not charge fees for authors. We do not limit access only to those authors excuse me, who have the resources to raise funds to pay for their fees, thus maintaining a truly open access model of publishing and promoting equity in the field. We are very pleased to present this special issue of the journal, which offers new insights into the gendered experiences of girls and boys seeking quality education in contexts of conflict and crisis. In keeping with our priorities for the journal, this issue provides actionable data for policymakers who are hoping to improve learning outcomes for children and to support their families in doing so, living in emergency contexts. The rigorous research and the cutting edge field note contained in this issue also continue our efforts to support equity and social justice throughout the production of knowledge and dissemination of evidence for the field. JEiE offers crucial observational and explanatory data from practitioners, researchers, and policymakers, and from research teams comprising all three of these groups who work together to write their articles, and also to carry out data collection and promote access and dissemination of this work. These team members who seek to gain a more comprehensive understanding of various practical questions approach their subjects with methodological rigor that breaks common boundaries that we often find between research and practice. This special issue of the Journal on Education Emergencies offers an in-depth analysis of the unique gendered effects humanitarian emergencies have on boys and girls, spurred by the commitment G7 leaders made in the Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education for Girls adolescent girls and women in developing countries, to advance gender equality in education through sex disaggregated data and evidence-based systems of accountability. This issue brings attention to the role scholarly research can play in improving access to and parity in the quality of education for learners affected by displacement, political fragility, and violence. JEiE Volume 8, Number 2 includes 5 research articles, 1 field note, 3 book reviews. The contributing authors share analysis from research and fieldwork conducted around the world, specifically here, including the Middle East, North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. This special issue ties the crisis of girls' unequal access to quality education with the worldwide impact of COVID-19 in several ways and brings into stark relief the particular vulnerabilities of education systems that are simultaneously confronting existing inequalities and novel emergencies. Before we give the floor to our speakers, I'd like to briefly thank our journal staff, including Samantha Colon, Emily Dunlop, Joao Sotomayor, Nathan Thompson, and our senior managing editor and program director, Heddy Lahmann, who you just heard from, without whom none of this would have been possible. I'm very pleased to introduce our representative from Global Affairs Canada, Zora Lokani, along with our lead editors, who did an incredible job curating and guiding this special issue. We're so appreciative of all of their work. They've really gone above and beyond the call of duty to produce and promote the special issue. Zora Lokani is an analyst in Education for Global Affairs Canada. She leads corporate planning and reporting, including on the $400 million of Charlevoix funding, policy and programming on education in line with Canada's feminist international assistance policy. I'm glad to see that Canada joins Sweden and a couple of others to have feminist foreign policy. And I look forward to hearing more about that foreign policy, not necessarily in this forum, but outside as well. In addition to her role as a project officer with INEE, so Zora wears a number of hats. She's also carried out research on refugee education policy in East Africa as part of her graduate work in comparative and international development education. Ruth Naylor, who's one of our lead editors on this issue, has worked in international education development since 1999 as a consultant, advisor, researcher, and trainer. Her areas of expertise include girls' education, gender equity, education in conflict-affected countries, monitoring and evaluation, and teacher management. She was the lead author for INEE's Mind the Gap Global Monitoring Report on Girls' Education in Crisis and Conflict. She was the chair of the 2021 UCFIT Biennial International Conference. Julia Dykam is an educationist specializing in war, conflict, and refugee contexts. Julia has worked in the field of education, humanitarian assistance, and international development globally, and in Canada for 25 years. Currently, Julia is the director of the Research and Training Portfolio at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC, in Canada. Julia holds a PhD in comparative international development education from JEiE at the University of Toronto. And finally, Karine Alaf, unfortunately, is not able to join us today, but she is a board member for the Journal on Education Emergencies. She has worked as a teacher, scholar, practitioner in the United States and in multiple countries across the Arab world over the last 20 years. She is currently the Senior Programs Advisor at Qatar Foundation International, an education organization committed to advancing Arabic language and culture in schools. She leads QFI's research portfolio, including internal monitoring, evaluation, and geographic expansion. So now I will pass the mic over to Zora. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Zora. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Burde, and I appreciate that kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Zora Lokani, and I'm the analyst with the education team at Global Affairs Canada, and also responsible for the INEE initiative that has supported this JEiE special issue on gender and education in emergencies. I'm really pleased to welcome you all today to the launch of this issue. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and express my gratitude for the opportunity to live and work on this land. So this timely publication comes at the 4-year anniversary of the commitments to Charlevoix, as Dr. Burde mentioned. Looking back, we see the way in which Charlevoix marked a significant shift in global priorities, particularly towards quality education and skills training for women and girls. Continued monitoring and increased transparency around these funding commitments and their results are actually captured in the Canada-funded Charlevoix dashboard. Through such tools, we can increase sustainable support to gendered experiences within education in crisis contexts. Furthermore, this special issue on gender aligns with Canada's feminist international assistance policy and amplifies Canada's priorities to advance gender equality in education through sex disaggregated data and evidence-based systems of accountability, which we will hear more about from the speakers today. As Dr. Burde mentioned, this publication brings attention to the role academic journals play in accountability for and the advancement of gender equality in education and emergencies. It demonstrates why scholarship, policy, and practice all need to be interlinked and informed by one another. This is why Canada is actually funding a new initiative with the INEE focused on strengthening data and evidence to inform policy and practice in education for children and youth affected by different forms of crises. This journal gives voice to the learners and how they experience their schooling. This aligns with the work Canada is doing to prioritize the voices of those with lived experiences, particularly through Canada's Together for Learning campaigns, Refugee Education Council, and Youth Manifesto. And if any of you have been able to check in on the Transforming Education Summit, our PSC, our parliamentary secretary, actually yielded the floor to Nal Dang, who is a youth refugee representative. So we are really working to explore and prioritize the voices of the youth. And Canada is proud to support this journal on education and emergencies special issue on gender that highlights experiences in diverse contexts, including North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. We also recognize the concerted efforts by the authors to respond to the gaps in evidence and data through data analysis and disaggregation, and their focus on gendered education experiences, particularly during COVID-19, to achieve gender equality in emergency settings. I look forward to learning more about the research published in the journal from the editors and authors during today's session. Thank you so much.
Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Sorry, I was having a problem with my video. Thank you for those wonderful introductions, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Now, we've known for decades that gender in education in emergencies is a really important issue and needs to be addressed. And for a long time, it's been the practitioners leading the way with some great frameworks and guidance delivered. More recently, political leaders and other advocates have been really raising awareness of the importance of girls' education, including in contexts of crisis. But despite this, the challenges still persist. We know there's still gender gaps in education, and we know that gender-based violence is just far too prevalent, both in schools and out of schools. And these problems are exacerbated by displacement, by conflict, by crisis, and have probably been made worse further by the COVID pandemic. And historically, there's also been another gap, which is the evidence and research gap. And that's often partly because of the real lack of good disaggregated data in these contexts. Now, as mentioned before, in 2018, the G7 leaders called for improvement in sex and age disaggregated data in these contexts through the Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education for Girls, Adolescent Girls, and Women in Developing Countries. So this special edition on gender responds to that call, providing researchers with an opportunity to share a deeper reflection of these issues and to highlight the role that sound, robust research can play in driving change in education. So I'll hand over to Julia now.
Thank you, Ruth. In developing the call for proposals for this special edition, we considered 3 questions. First, what constitutes an emergency? Second, is this an issue about gender or about girls' education? And third, do we want to include COVID-19 in the call for proposals? Our reflections highlighted a number of the ongoing as well as newer debates in the field, expanding what could be included in the parameters to include high income, middle income, and lower income countries, climate change adaptation, and the COVID-19 pandemic. We also agreed that a gender equality approach required the inclusion of an equitable approach to addressing girls' and boys' unique needs in emergencies, particularly for the most marginalized. This has resulted in a special edition of 5 articles, 1 field note, and 3 book reviews. By taking the chance to include COVID-19, even though it was the very earliest days of the pandemic when we began to discuss this special edition, we have been able to include some early research on the gendered effects of this unprecedented global close down of education, as well as a consideration of methods of data collection in a time when access to schools and learning in an emergency faced restrictions never seen before. Gendered considerations of the learner experience and a noticeable increase in attention to intersectionality is another theme across the published articles, reminding us that each learner has a multiplicity of identities which affect learner experience and success. A non-traditional view of the term emergency allowed us to include crises in high-income countries, as well as outside of traditionally thought of emergency spaces. This includes comparative research on gender-based violence, as well as the integration of refugees in school systems in high-income countries. And I'm going to give it back to Ruth now.
So thank you, Julia. That just leaves me to thank all the individuals and organisations that have helped bring this into a reality, this special edition. The publication was generously funded by the Government of Canada through the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. And we're really grateful to all our contributors, the authors and the book reviewers. And I'd also like to thank those of you who submitted articles that we weren't able to include in the final edition. They're really appreciated. And a huge thank you to the peer reviewers, without whom we wouldn't be able to maintain the high standards of academic rigor that this journal maintains. And the team at the journal are just amazing. They've been brilliant at progressing this through. I think Dana's already mentioned their names, but thank you so much. And for everyone involved, we know that during the pandemic, it's been a time of juggling. You've been juggling childcare, you've been juggling pivoting programs or pivoting data collection. And so just congratulations on making it through, and thank you so much for all the effort that's been involved in getting this special edition to become a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Zora. It is now my pleasure to briefly introduce our panelists. So first, presenting Peace-Building Education to Address Gender-Based Aggression, Youth's Experiences in Mexico, Bangladesh, and Canada. Najme Keshani Farahani is a research associate at the University of Toronto, currently located in Toronto. Next, presenting Barriers to Refugee Adolescents' Educational Access During COVID-19, Exploring the Roles of Gender Displacement and Social Inequalities. Nicola Jones is a Principal Research Fellow at the ODI, currently located in London. Then presenting Girls and Boys' Voices on the Gendered Experience of Learning During COVID-19 in Countries Affected by Displacement. Nicole Dulieu is the Senior Director of Evidence and Learning at Save the Children, currently located in the UK. Then presenting Intersectionality, Experiences of Gender Socialization and Racialization for Iraqi Students Resettled in the United States. Flora Cohen is a PhD student at the Washington University in St. Louis Brown School of Social Work, currently located in Missouri. Then presenting Refugee Girls Secondary Education in Ethiopia, examining the vulnerabilities of refugees and host communities in low resource displacement settings. Shelby Carvalho is a doctoral student at Harvard Political Science and an instructor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, currently located in Providence, Rhode Island. And then finally, presenting Data Disaggregation for Inclusive Quality Education in Emergencies, the COVID-19 Experience in Ghana. Abdul Badi Saibu is a master's student in international development, formerly at Plan International Ghana, now at the Ghana Institute of Public Administration, or JEIMPA, and currently located in Ghana. So we have a full schedule. So a reminder to our panelists to keep your presentations to 4 minutes. Nathan Thompson will be running the slides for us. So if you need a slide to be progressed, just say next slide, please, and he'll be on top of that. And then Emily, our terrific technical editor, if you wouldn't mind turning on your video for a moment. When you see Emily's face, that means that you have 20 seconds to wrap up your presentation. So just note that she'll be your timekeeper for today. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Najme Kishani Farahani to get us started.
Hello, everyone. It's very exciting to be here. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on when you are. It's a pleasure to present here today. I'm presenting the article that I co-authored with my supervisor, Professor Kathy Bichmer, the supervisor of the project, about the role of peace-building education in addressing gender-based aggressions in 3 non-war zones. Gender-based violence is a normalized emergency that happens alongside everyday violence. But despite its omnipresence, it has not been sufficiently problematized in peace-building education research and practices, unfortunately. But education needs to address the gender ideologies and hierarchies that encourage both direct physical aggression and indirect harm, such as marginalization and exploitation, in order to build durable peace. Schools can help young people to build on their motivation, relationships, and capability to participate in building gender just peace, even though formal education systems usually are shaped by gendered patterns of social conflict and inequity. We can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in this paper led by Kathy, we examined the gender dimensions of social conflicts and violence that young people in Mexico, Bangladesh, and Canada experienced. And we examined the ways their teachers responded to their students' concerns. We drew from focus group research conducted with the students and teachers in public schools in diverse settings in these 3 countries. In this slide, you see more details about the participating schools, students, teachers, and the number of focus groups and sessions. So I jump to the findings. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Here you see our conceptual framework to make sense of our data, showing the interconnected direct and indirect forms of violence and therefore peace. By indirect form, we mean social structural pattern of inequitable access to tangible resources, such as discrimination against women that result in their disproportionate level of poverty and vulnerability. And psychocultural dimension, which refers to the norms and narratives that legitimize direct violence and oppression, such as misogyny. And we have equivalent dimensions for peace. We found that gender-based violence was pervasive in students' lives in all 3 countries. The female and male participants in all focus groups in 3 countries described having frequent experiences with direct gendered violence. These students and their teachers also showed some awareness of the cultural and social structural dimension of gender exploitations that legitimized and exacerbated gender-based violence. Yet, the curriculum the teachers and students described, with minor differences between contexts, included only few opportunities to examine or resist the gender norms, institutions, and hierarchies that are at the root of exploitation and violence. Gender conflict was almost never addressed in any curriculum practices in the Canadian schools, and it was rarely mentioned by the Mexican and Bangladeshi participants. In Bangladesh, it was mostly about dowry practices, and in Mexico, mostly about domestic violence. The teachers in all three study locations were constrained by neoliberal individualism, which led them to frame their teaching and learning goals in terms of individual self-control, morality, and character, rather than understanding of institutional processes or the development of skills to take action for peace building. This comparative international evidence shows urgent need to attend to gender-based violence and to its underlying cultural and social structural causes and remedies. And I end with this sentence, but what is important is that such education needs to be part of the everyday school life and peace building. I think my 4 minutes should be over, and it was great to present here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Najmeh. Just a reminder to our attendees, you can feel free to post your questions as we go along. No need to hold them till the end. You can post them in the chat if you like, as presenters are sharing their presentations. And next, I will turn it over to Nicola Jones.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors from JEiE, from George Washington University, and from UNICEF. And our article focuses on the barriers to Rohingya and Syrian refugee adolescents' education during the COVID-19 pandemic. We took an intersectional lens looking at the ways in which forced displacement intersected with gender and other forms of social inequality like disability. Next slide, please. So our study was nested within the much larger Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Gauge longitudinal research program. So we undertook a mixed methods research approach involving surveys with approximately 3,000 adolescents in Jordan, so Syrian refugees living in either camps, host communities, or informal tented settlements, and then also Rohingya refugees living in camps in Cox's Bazar. And we complemented the survey findings with more in-depth qualitative interviews with both adolescent girls and boys and with key informants. All of this was carried out by phone during the first 6 months of the pandemic in 2020. I think what's really important to highlight is that while we are focused on refugee adolescent experiences, that these were very distinct. So in Jordan, Syrian refugees already had access to formal education through double shift schools in Jordan, and access to non-formal education tuition as well through the nationwide Makani program run by NGOs and coordinated by UNICEF. When schools closed in March 2020, the government rapidly launched distance education via television and digital platforms. However, there were also very important pre-existing divides in terms of access to technology based on poverty and gender, and also refugee status, as you can see here. By contrast, the Rohingya refugees had no access to formal education at that time. Less than a third were accessing non-formal education in the camps, but here there were also significant gender gaps, and particularly for older adolescent girls. The lockdown then restricted access to these educational opportunities in the camps, and this was further exacerbated by internet connectivity challenges and the suspension of 3G and 4G mobile networks during this time period. Next slide, please. So just to touch briefly on some of the key findings, what we found in the Rohingya camps in terms of gender was while the learning centers were closed, particularly for older adolescent girls, because the pre-pandemic access was so limited that girls actually focused much more on other aspects of deprivation rather than on education because they'd already been excluded. In Jordan, by contrast, 2/3 of adolescents reported that they had some form of learning support during the pandemic, although less than half had been in touch with a teacher in the last 7 days, and only 15% were accessing online education. And this was particularly low amongst adolescent girls, who reported increased time poverty and gender norms that prohibited their use of phones and internet access, even for learning purposes. What came through really strongly by both adolescent and girls and boys in Jordan was the very poor quality of distance education and the lack of opportunities for interactions and to ask questions. And we also found that there was some important mitigation for those who were fortunate enough to be part of non-formal education, that the support that they had in terms of access to peers and to trusted adults supported the learning process. So in terms of policy implications, just very briefly, what we highlight is the need to tackle girls' time poverty by incentivizing girls' access to education through social protection programming, perhaps cash transfers for education, to be ensuring that there's access to both high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech to support refugees' access to education. And then finally, to think about increased investments in non-formal education that is able to be sustained by community members during crises, so that then young people have access to trusted non-family adults and peers, which is so critical, supporting the learning process and mitigating against mental ill health during crises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And I will now turn it over to Nicole. Nicole, do you?
Thanks so much. So I'm presenting today on a research article co-authored with colleagues from Save the Children, Sylvia Alvini, Maya Gordon, and Alison Cooper. And in 2020, we set ourselves one of the most ambitious research targets to date, which is to interview 17,000 parents and about 8,000 children age 11 to 18 about the impacts of COVID-19 across 46 countries. And this is at a time that 9 in 10 children reporting their schools were closed. So what I'm presenting here today is the results of a multivariate logistic regression model analysis from 10 countries in this survey, all with higher rates of displacement. And we took a feminist and a child rights-based approach. And the challenge we set ourselves as a study team was to analyze data to see if there were gender differentials and learning loss, and to understand 1,186 children's own perceptions of learning loss. The data came from a quantitative survey, complemented with qualitative responses to 5 open-ended questions, which really gave us a window into children's own concerns, their worries, and the interrelated dimensions of the impact of COVID-19 on their lives. Next slide, please. So we know from previous research that extreme shocks often result in a decline in learning. And we also know displaced children are twice as likely to be out of school as those who are not displaced. Findings from our analysis showed that these children in displaced settings were more likely to perceive a decline in their learning than those who are non-displaced. And the reasons for this differed between girls and boys. Perhaps unsurprisingly, girls' perceptions of learning nothing or a little bit were strongly associated with material barriers, family income loss, more numbers of children in the family. All of these contributed to a lack of educational access for a girl, especially when she is displaced. But what we found quite surprising was that the boys' experience of declining in learning was really strongly associated with negative feelings. So boys feeling sad, were worried, reporting increased violence in the home, or actually just having to look after other siblings, all reported lower levels of learning. And while girls reported the same challenges, this wasn't correlated to them learning a little bit or nothing, which to us sadly suggests that perhaps girls were more accustomed to pursuing learning despite these challenges in well-being, violence, and domestic chores. Next slide, please. So our recommendations, it wouldn't be research without recommending more research. specifically into the provision of support for boys to maintain learning in emotionally challenging environments. What was really special about this study was hearing children's own recommendations. So a great example is an 11-year-old boy in Colombia who responded to the question, what would you ask leaders in your country to do? And he said, I want the leaders to find a way to help children like my brother and me who are migrants and my mum who doesn't have a real job. I want them to give us opportunities to go to school, to study, give jobs to our parents so they don't fight, shout or abuse each other. And examples like this really demonstrate the complexities and the interrelations of multiple factors impacting life for a displaced child. Overall, we call for governments to provide adequate resources and equitable access to education so that groups of children aren't left behind. But we're also calling for cross-sectoral programming to provide continuous access to alternative education to support displaced children dealing with emotional pressure. And finally, this is a reminder to all of us here that children are acutely aware of the impact school closures have on their quality of learning and the potential impact on their life trajectories. The children in the survey want to be heard, and society can't afford to exclude today's generation of children in decisions that really impact their lives, their survival, and their educational development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And next we'll hear from Flora Cohen.
Hi, everyone. I'm presenting about intersectionality experiences of gender socialization and racialization for Iraqi students resettled in the US on behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Sarah Meyer, Dr. Alana Saf, Cyril Bonona, Dr. Karine Alaf, and Dr. Lindsay Stark. And this project was funded by Qatar Foundation International. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll tell you a little bit about the background to this work and some of the methods that were used. So basically in the US following 9/11, there have been a lot of discriminatory political ramifications for refugees resettlement in the US. So we thought it would be interesting to really explore how these ramifications have affected the way that adolescent boys and girls are treated. The study is part of a larger study on adolescent lives after migration that really looks at psychosocial well-being. But the majority of our participants were from Iraq. And as we were investigating our findings, we found that there are some really interesting components of gender dynamics. So I thought we would explore that a little bit further. So what we know about gender dynamics for adolescent boys and girls is that they're really especially vulnerable to gender socialization within the school setting. In the way that their peers treat them, in the way that their teachers treat them, and even service providers within the refugee community. And also racialization, especially for Iraqi students, because they are from the Middle East and North Africa region, they experience different types of treatment than their Hispanic or Latino peers. And also these experiences can have ramifications. We know that racialization can have extensive ramifications for school achievement. So we wanted to look at how students were experiencing these things. So in order to look at that, this analysis is part of a larger study, the study on adolescent lives after migration to America, or SALAMA. SALAMA, since the collection of this data in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and Austin, Texas, has expanded to other cities in the US to really look at the experiences of teenagers within the school setting. For this study specifically, we had gender disaggregated school-based focus group discussions with high school students ages 13 to 23 who were born either in conflict-affected Middle East or North African countries during their family's displacement or during their family's displacement from one of those countries. We also had semi-structured interviews with caregivers of those participants. And also semi-structured interviews with key informants who included teachers, guidance counselors, school district division administrators, caseworkers, therapists, and personnel from non-governmental organizations. For this analysis, we employed intersectionality theory to explore the role of both gender socialization and racialization, specifically for Iraqi youth. And we argue that their experiences of these youth are impacted by both their gender and race dynamics, and those are experienced simultaneously, not separately. Within this qualitative analysis, we used thematic analysis and constant comparative method where excerpts of raw data were sorted and organized into groups according to attributes in order to formulate a new theory around gender and racialization. And this was a secondary analysis of the codes. So move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So for our results, we found some really interesting findings about the ways students were experiencing resettlement in the US in their school setting. The one thing that was similar across both boys and girls is this, that they had been called a terrorist within the school setting, or sometimes students would say they would throw bombs in schools, which was really upsetting to the participants. But there are also some gender dynamics in the ways that these different perceptions played out for them. For boys specifically, sometimes they would be prompted to get into physical altercations with their peers. One boy even explained that when he experienced a miscommunication with a peer, a school faculty member encouraged him to engage in violent behavior, which seemed to be more of a gendered norm. The faculty member stated, yeah, like they're going to fight you to see how good you are. And if you're not good, they're just going to keep on fighting you again. But many students responded, many of these Iraqi adolescents responded that, quote, life is not that crazy. And they had no interest in doing that. Other boys emphasized that it was important to be nice to other people because when you help them, they can help you. And so they participated in school activities like sports with their peers to make friends and support each other. Boys also carried a lot of responsibility for their families. They felt a pull to work and to earn income for their families. They were also expected to act as a primary translator, sometimes accepting calls from schools on behalf of their parents, who might have been a bit slower to learn English in this new setting. And they also supported their younger siblings in an equal manner to their sisters. Meanwhile, girls experienced something different. So many girls experienced teachers stating that they noted that they had changed cultures when they entered into the United States. One teacher pointed to a girl and said, whenever she got here, she took off her scarf. And the girl was actually insulted because she'd never worn one. Even in all of her travels through Iraq, Syria, Turkey, she didn't wear it. Another girl noted, does everyone in Mexico just carry around maracas and start shaking them everywhere? Oh, yes. Okay. Really quickly, so there was a gender shift during resettlement to the United States. Gendered behaviors were either reinforced or challenged by parents, teachers, and peers, and racialization and discrimination was affecting them in various ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flora. And now we'll hear from Shelby Carvalho.
Great, thank you so much. Today I will be presenting a short snapshot of my paper, Refugee Girls' Secondary Education in Ethiopia, examining the vulnerabilities of refugees and host communities in low resource displacement settings. Next slide, please. So we know that gender gaps and gender-based vulnerabilities can be made much worse in humanitarian settings. In this paper, I build on a rich and growing body of qualitative literature to examine some quantitative trends related to girls' education for both refugee and host community children and adolescents. To do this, I ask two sets of related questions. The first set of questions examines trends in participation between refugee and host community girls to try to examine where we see common trends and sources of vulnerability, as well as where we see unique or potentially more severe trends for one group or the other. The second set of questions focuses in on gender gaps specifically among refugee students to examine the ways in which gender gaps vary across refugee groups and camp locations, as well as to try to pinpoint some of the vulnerabilities that may be specific to refugee girls. I focus this analysis on the secondary education level because I think gender gaps really start to grow as children get older and as they progress through the education system. In Kenya and Ethiopia, for example, girls are 60% less likely to be in secondary education than boys. So the motivation for this study, particularly in the face of new policies moving toward greater refugee inclusion and integration in national systems, was to try to identify subnational variation and differences in vulnerabilities experienced by refugees and host communities. Because without doing so, I think that we risk overlooking the barriers of the most vulnerable, which can result in ineffective policies, or in the worst case scenario, can actually be harmful to girls. Additionally, in many contexts, I think refugee and host community young people face many of the same challenges in accessing quality education. So here I try to identify potential commonalities and promising areas for jointly targeted interventions and inclusive policies. This work is set in Ethiopia. Ethiopia hosts between 800,000 and 1 million refugees who primarily live in camp settings. When refugees want to attend secondary school in Ethiopia, they have to travel outside of camps to national secondary schools. Camps are located primarily in remote areas, which often face educational deprivations compared to other areas, and may also have severe gender gaps in host communities. So to look at these trends, I used 2 large household surveys focusing on refugees and their immediately surrounding host communities within 5 to 10 kilometers of the refugee camps. By looking at refugees and their directly surrounding host communities, I'm able to see how trends for refugee girls not only compare to boys in their same communities, but also to girls who may be their peers in the communities that surround them. You can go to the final slide, please. My findings suggest, I have sort of 4 main findings. The first is that, unfortunately, the large-scale statistics suggesting that there are significant gaps, particularly for refugee girls, are correct. Refugee girls are less likely to be in secondary school than refugee boys and host community boys and girls. But I do find that refugee girls and host community girls face many of the same challenges, particularly around high rates of gender-based violence, which may indicate that this would be a productive area for interventions and policies targeting both girls in both communities to try to reduce this challenge that girls face. However, there are some challenges that are either unique to or much more severe for refugee girls, including much higher rates of domestic responsibilities at home that fall much more often to girls, as well as much higher reported concerns about community safety, which seem to impact girls more than boys who may be traveling outside of refugee camps to attend schools and host communities. Finally, I find that while I do see consistency in some trends, they do actually vary quite a bit across refugee camps and refugee groups, suggesting that when we think about national policies, national interventions, that there are important subnational sources of variation and group level variations that are important to be sort of reflected in how we approach inclusive policies going forward to make sure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. So thanks so much for listening. I hope that you check out the paper and look forward to questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby. And last but certainly not least, over to you, Abdul Badi Saibu.
Thank you, Henry. So basically, this article is on my experience working during the middle of the pandemic and the school closures to find ways to get remote learning technology to some of the most vulnerable children in the world. Next slide, please. So just by way of background, during the peak of the pandemic in Ghana, that was in 2020, the government collaborated with the Plan International to make remote learning accessible to as many children as possible in the country. Specifically, a UK funded project, which I worked on as a JEiE manager, was leading this process from the organization point. And as a JEiE manager, I was responsible for ensuring that we get a lot of data within the constraints of the pandemic to be able to make adaptations, especially given that this was a new something that the program was actually pivoting towards. And basically, they were looking at two things. That is how to collect data in the middle of all the issues that were happening, and then also how to analyze that data. Now, whilst we were scrambling for that, for methods to do this, it got me thinking about logic models, which we have been using as JEiE practitioners to do problem analysis, especially when we are designing interventions within an EIE context. And at the end of the day, we use the logic model to do all the analysis that was needed and the adaptations that were needed. Next slide, please. So basically, the main article, we try to go detail into what the logic models are and what they can be used for, especially in analyzing data and generating insight from a set of data. Then we also discuss a lot the advantages of using the logic model in such a situation. For instance, in the situation in Ghana, when the pandemic started and all schools were closed down and were pivoting to remote learning methodologies, the frequency of data collection went very high. For instance, at some point, we were collecting data on a weekly basis, and how to generate insights from all this data became very challenging using traditional data analysis methods, and that was one of the key advantages. One other advantage I saw using this logic model, which is shared in the article, is the fact that it's very effective at identifying intersectionalities, especially among project beneficiaries or EIE program beneficiaries, and doing the adaptations. Previous article presentations have touched on the intersectionalities and how it can generate additional vulnerability among beneficiaries. And so, for instance, in the Ghanaian context, we're looking at girls and boys as, gender, for instance, as one of the factors of marginalization. And then we look at issues of disability and even girls who are young mothers and all that. How does that add additional vulnerability to girls? And this method of data analysis was actually very effective in doing that, that kind of analysis. So basically, that is what it's about. So it's about my experience using this method in doing this analysis. And lucky for this method, the logic model is something that MAE professionals and project managers use a lot. And so it will be something that will be easily adopted in data analysis within the context that emergency education methods are used. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abdul, and thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your terrific presentations and for being so succinct in packing so much terrific information into 4 minutes. We really appreciate it. So now it's time to hear questions from attendees. I see there's one question in the Q&A, and a reminder to attendees that you'll need to type your questions into the Q&A as mics are muted. But this question is for all of the panelists. This comes from Richard Boateng. I would like to know the role host countries are playing in eliminating gender-based violence. So this is certainly a broad question that applies to a number of the presentations we heard from. I wonder if we can start off with Najme. Would you like to kick us off, or if there's another panelist that would prefer to begin, that's also fine. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So our study was a comparative study between Canada, Bangladesh, and Mexico. And we purposefully selected these non-war zones, but the violent areas and more marginalized areas in these countries to show how gender-based violence is omnipresent and is pervasive in the experience, in the lived experience of children. So the role of host countries, we studied the way that these children have experienced the curriculum at the school and how their teachers have been addressing gender-based violence in this context, in these diverse settings. And it was surprising to some extent that their lived experiences of gender-based violence, students' lived experiences, was not reflected in the curriculum that they were experiencing at the school, even though they were really concerned about this topic. That was an elicitation. We use elicitation techniques. So children like had a set of social conflict image prompts that they prompted them to talk about those conflicts. One of the prompts that I showed in the slides was specifically about gender-based violence, but gender-based violence, different dimensions, the cultural dimensions and social structural dimensions came out in relation to all of the conflicts that they talked about. But for example, in Canada, teachers found addressing gender-based violence a sensitive topic to talk about. And in Bangladesh, there was a bit talk in the classrooms about that, but it was mostly focused on dowry practices. And in Mexico, it was about domestic violence. So that's why we found that like there were more similarities between these contexts than the differences. There are more details to talk about, but I am also aware of the limited time that I have, and I want to room a space for other panelists to address the question. And please send me an email or Kathy Bickmer if you have further questions.
Thank you, Najmi. And I'll invite any of our other panelists who would like to respond to this question. Nicola?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. In the case of Syrian refugees in Jordan, what we saw was that the non-formal education program that I mentioned, the Makani initiative, that was doing a lot to try and compensate for the dearth of discussions in the formal education system about gender-based violence. So the adolescents who were participating in that were educated around concepts of violence, so psychological violence, physical violence, sexual and verbal and even economic violence, and then how to report that. And we heard from both adolescent girls and boys, so that was the first time they were having those types of discussions, but that was very empowering. And a number of girls in our sample had reported particularly experiences of sexual harassment to teachers or to the Makani program facilitators. And while the program was initiated by UNICEF and was originally working only with NGOs, over time, the government Ministry of Social Development has partnered in the rollout of the program and has brought into it. So I think that's very important in terms of tackling gender-based violence. Also, as part of this initiative, there's a pilot linkage to a cash transfer program. So cash is given to the most vulnerable refugee and host community families for adolescent girls and boys to attend education. And there's been particularly a focus on ensuring that the transfer amount is sufficient to cover the cost of transportation for girls, so that they're able to travel safely to and from school without risk of sexual harassment or sexual assault, which in the context is very important because there's high concerns about family honor, and that adolescent girls are often seen as responsible for maintaining family honor in the context.
Thank you, Nicola. Do any other panelists want to respond to this particular question about gender-based violence and the role of host communities? Shall we go ahead?
I just briefly wanted to add on, I think that it sounds like a lot of the context that we're working in, just sort of recognizing that specifically gender-based violence is also often a prevalent problem in host communities as well. So I think as we sort of think about, responsibility for combating gender-based violence, to also sort of reflect on the ways in which this is prevalent in host communities and how partners in host communities can be leveraged to think about both for displaced populations, but also for populations in the community, in the host communities as well. So just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you, Shelby. So I see another question in the Q&A, unless, of course, if there's another panelist that would like to respond, please go ahead and turn your video on. Otherwise, there is a question to Abdul in the Q&A asking, this is from Vanya Baruet, could you be more explicit on the way the logic tree was used for disaggregated data collection? So could you speak to that question, Abdul?
Thank you. So I think one of the key things we first have to understand is that logic models are used to diagnose problems. So that is why it's a very effective tool when we are doing the design of programs, especially within the EIE context. Now, if you have this at the back of our mind, and then we have a data set, then what we are just saying is that the data set contains insights, just like a larger question in the design of programs contain insights that we want to see. So a data set contains insights that we want to see. So what are the insights? In the Ghanaian example that is shared in the article, we have data set. We want to see the data contain both, contain boys and girls, and we want to see what is the data saying about both boys and girls. So then we have a larger issue that we are disaggregating, which is gender. Now, when you disaggregate by gender, which is a larger issue we are looking at, it's easy with a logic model to see, okay, so what is the relationship, or what is how are girls performing within the issue or the context we are looking at relative to boys. So for instance, in the article, we are looking at one issue of access to remote learning facilities. So how are boys and girls access? So if we look at access, then we can disaggregate the access data by gender. But when you come to girls, which was the focus of the example that was shared in the article, when we come to girls, there are so many other factors that can affect girls. So if we have girls, say 90% of girls are having access, does that mean every type of girl, every girl with every vulnerability is accessing equally? Then we can begin to look at the different vulnerabilities and disaggregate the data along that line. At the end of the day, it becomes like a tree, just like a logic tree with branches. So for instance, we have a branch on young mother status, that is girls who have children of their own and girls who are not. And then we have a branch on disability. Then you could even have a branch on young mothers who have disabilities. And that is where I said it has been very effective in identifying intersectionalities. One of the key things within the EIE context is to identify these intersectionalities, because we have factors that really make it very difficult for some groups of beneficiaries to have access and to improve in terms of the phenomenon that we are looking at. So basically that is done, and then you continue disaggregating. We have some constraints. For instance, we said in the article that, or I said in the article that when you reach a point where, for instance, a particular disaggregation is almost close to zero, I mean, in terms of the phenomena you are looking at, then you stop disaggregating, because what it means is that any further branch will not yield new information. Equally, on the far end, if you have a particular phenomenon getting close to 100% of recording 100%, then you stop disaggregating, because any disaggregation will not necessarily yield a new information. So basically that is it. And at the end of the day, that you have a tree, just like we disaggregate a problem with all the branches pointing to the different issues or different vulnerabilities that you can see within the data set. Heddy.
Thank you so much, Abdul. I don't think we have another question pending in the Q&A. So if there isn't one at the top of anyone's mind, I am certainly willing to pose a question to the panelists. So here's a question for all of you or anyone who would like to respond. So thinking across the learnings from your own research and or across the evidence that's been shared today, what should be the top priority? If you could only choose one, what would be the top priority that you would suggest that policymakers need to prioritize or take into consideration? Any panelists, all panelists that would like to respond to that question, and I'll post it.
So let me start on that question. For me, maybe because I'm also an MAE biased person, I would say that data should be one of the top priorities. I mean, if I look at the Ghana example, we had whole groups. When we started the data disaggregation within the context that we are talking about, we had whole groups, sometimes based on language. In other words, minority tribes completely left out within the implementation process. And I mean, within the educational ecosystem that was created within that period. And so for me, if we don't do a lot of data collection and disaggregation, our indicators might be showing very good results at the global view. I mean, in terms within the national context. But yet, we are having whole groups who are either children with disabilities or who are children, let's say girls who are young mothers, completely left out. In fact, we have situations where some groups were recording 0% access in terms of remote learning technologies or remote learning facilities. So for me, the top priority within the context should be on getting a lot of data, disaggregating that data, and ensuring that everybody is participating well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Abdul. Najmi.
Thanks again for the question. So gender-based violence is an emergency issue that is very prevalent in non-emergency settings. And a lot of time in our comparative study, no matter in which context, we realize that if they are addressing that, it's addressing the symptom of gender-based violence, not really getting to the cultural and social structural root causes that legitimize and reinforce gender-based violence. So, and we also looked at the role of formal education. We know that a lot of the time, formal education is a place for discrimination and even promoting gender-based stereotypes, but at the same time, if there's we realize that there's a possibility that we can address gender-based violence within the schools. Students are asking for that. The students asked us and wished that they could really, their teachers and the school authority address this topic further, even though their teachers felt that like, no, it's either sensitive, or if they addressed that, it was just not addressing the root causes. So the main focus and the main recommendation would be to really address gender-based violence in the formal education at the root cultural and social structural causes. Thank you.
Go ahead, Nicola.
I would say a top priority would be to invest in cash transfer plus programming. And by that, I mean ensuring that there is a labeled cash transfer for education. I think we're increasingly seeing that cash transfers that go to the general household may not be invested, particularly in girls' education, but where it's labeled and parents are aware that that's how the resources should be used, it can be very powerful. And then the plus component refers to provision of interventions that would then address some of the social or gender norms that may be hindering girls' continuity of learning. So depending on the context, whether that's awareness raising about laws related to child marriage and the risk related to that. That's something we see a lot with the Rohingya and the Syrian refugees in the longitudinal study that I was sharing the results from, but also then the provision of safe spaces where girls will then have access to a trusted adult outside of the formal education system, where they have access, for example, in the Jordanian context, or it's particularly important where girls are shut out of formal education in the Rohingya camps, that they then have access to these types of safe spaces and a trusted non-family adult that they can turn to for issues related to gender-based violence or an impending risk of child marriage, for example. So I would have a strong plug for Cash Transfer Plus programming.
Shelby, go ahead.
Great, thanks. I think my top lesson is one that, even sort of saying it in my head, sounds very simple in some ways, but I think one of the things that I see sort of overlooked in a lot of the global pushes for refugee inclusion and integration, as well as sort of national policy plans for inclusion, is the acknowledgement of subnational and sort of group level variation in what different vulnerabilities look like, the sources of those vulnerabilities and severity of those vulnerabilities. And I think that, sort of taking global or nationally aggregate approaches can, like I said, sort of risk ineffective policies, but can also, I think, risk causing greater harm to girls, particularly when we see that things like community safety and surrounding areas are sort of a top factor shaping family decisions about whether girls should participate in secondary school. I think that suggests both that we need to be very aware of how things like community safety and other factors vary across different locations within countries, but also suggests that education policies should not be sort of separate from thinking about things like wider community safety and other risk factors that really do have real consequences for the decisions that families make and the risks that girls take on a daily basis in trying to access school. So again, that top lesson would be trying to be, I think, a bit more nuanced in the policy decisions that we make, and in examining the vulnerabilities that different groups face to make sure that all children and adolescents have safe access to progress through the education system. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shelby. Just want to open it up if Nicole and or Flora would like to respond, and if not, that's okay too.
Sure, I can jump in. Thank you that's a really big question. So I was sitting here listening to everyone and thinking, I agree with everything. I think one of the big things for me with this work is that I think someone else mentioned that we need to be a bit more preventative and create programs right from the beginning. We know that, especially with youth, they're really impacted by their social ecologies, by their families, by their schools, especially when they're in school. And so it's important to consider gender in those environments and the ways that we treat boys and girls or non-binary folks differently based on their gender, especially within humanitarian settings where these things can also be so exacerbated when we don't pay attention to those gender dynamics. So I think more interest in more prevention before it gets to the point of more extensive gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thanks, Flora. And then I agree with pretty much everything that everyone else has said. I think the two areas that we would think would be incredibly important in here is around education for refugee children. So the international communities and the host governments really need to ensure that refugee children have access to good quality learning opportunities, but by closing the financing gap, developing inclusive policies and plans. And then also from our perspective, as a sectoral perspective, we need to do a lot better in terms of education in emergencies to prioritize education within emergencies and improve our coordination, policies and plans with each other to deliver protective, safe, inclusive and quality learning environments in crises contexts. I think by improving the financing and increasing the amount that they're spending on education and then also better coordination, there's a more holistic wraparound support for children's education.
Thank you, Nicole. Okay.
Yeah, ready. Okay. Hi, everybody. We're just, coordinating our, since we're sitting in the same space, coordinating our sound over here. Thank you all so much. This has been terrific to listen to this incredible set of papers, this incredible amount of work that you've all engaged in. A question for me that comes up really related to this last discussion is about take up, actually getting policymakers to take up findings. This is a big question, I think, among many, many academics, many funders of research. I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for concrete steps that you have considered or maybe even engaged in yourselves to influence policymaker take up, lawmakers taking up findings such as yours. And let me just build on that. Let me just frame that question a little bit by noting that we all are seeing around the world now democratic backsliding and rise of authoritarianism. And let me note that these authoritarians are not women; they're men generally. And it's striking to see the links between democratic backsliding, authoritarianism, and the rollback of women's rights, including here in our own country, in the United States, I mean. Given that mountain to struggle against, how are there any special tips you can think of for influencing take up, given this sort of challenges that people feel, I think, internationally and certainly domestically in the United States that we're up against with regard to women's rights? Thanks for any insights. Any of you, this is a question to any of the panelists who want to speak to it. Thank you.
I can start. Okay, great. So I think the question about backsliding is particularly relevant in Ethiopia. I wanted to mention I conducted a lot of this research prior to the start of the new round of conflict there. So I think where there was really promising steps toward inclusion through the national government, through the process of the time that I was sort of writing this paper, those opportunities through the national government, I think, changed quite a bit. And I think that that's the case in many other places as well. And so one of the things I've been thinking about sort of in that context is there is still, I think, a big push to, you hear the sort of rhetoric around trying to bridge the humanitarian development divide. I think that there's a big interest from new actors like the World Bank through IDA sub-window financing for refugees to become involved in education and emergencies and refugee education where they may not otherwise have been. And so one of my strategies personally, I think, and in a context that's increasingly uncertain, has been to think about particularly where new actors are coming in and really trying to figure out, what they should be doing for the first time, where comparative advantages are, where greatest needs are to try to help to provide some of this data and to really, I think, highlight some of these nuances, but also highlight where development partners can come in and potentially be helpful in ways that may not be the comparative advantage of host governments or may be more difficult for host governments. So tangible recommendations might be things like in communities where, in the case of my study, girls may be traveling outside of host communities to attend secondary schools. If these are situations where families feel the community is unsafe outside of the camp, maybe support could be given to make sure that transportation routes are safe, school grounds are safe, and things like that can sound, I think, very basic, but maybe really kind of critical interventions that might make the difference. And I know, Dana, this is really relevant to your work about locations of schools and communities. And so thinking about how those kinds of things could be, a place where donors could productively come in and help move forward could be useful. Thanks.
And maybe just to complement what Shelby was saying, I think our experience in Gauge is that it's really critical to involve government and UN partners from the outset. So not to wait until you have the findings, but to involve them in discussions about the research design, getting them to comment on tools, building in enough time to do all of that, because it is much more labor and time intensive. So I think that's key. And then once the findings are out, then I think inviting them to present on the panels that they have to also then actually engage with the findings. That's really critical. We just have been doing a launch also in Ethiopia about some findings related to girls' education and child marriage, and by inviting both federal government stakeholders as well as regional stakeholders to comment on the panel, that ensured there was much less resistance. And I think just being very strategic about identifying champions within government. I mean, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and with enough careful mapping, then you can usually find a champion. So I think that's key.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you, Nicola. Any other panelists that would like to respond to Dana's question?
I'm a bit hesitant to share that because when thinking about a tangible recommendation, that's where it really gets very difficult. But I want to refer to a comparable study that to what I presented, and this was specifically in a semi-authoritarian context that we looked at the girls and boys from lower and higher socioeconomic neighborhoods. So we used intersectionality lens as well. What we realized was compatible with the critical feminist theory that these young people, we cannot and we should not necessarily interpret their, for example, their lack of motivation or even lack of participation in so-called like collective movements and protests as lack of agency or even apathy, because like this, so not necessarily challenge or question the Western dominant conception of agency, but expand it and to see how it is different in different countries. For example, girls in lower socioeconomic neighborhood in that semi-authoritarian context, they were playing the role of good girl with wearing modest dresses and not going out alone, not because they really wanted to conform with, they believed that is the right thing. They did that because they knew that this is the only way that they wanted to, they could get education and they could get out of home, and then eventually they could kind of get rid of that suppressive environment that surrounded them at home and at the school and in their community. So just in a nutshell, going from here is like, so it's very important that the kind of education, informal and non-formal education that we provide for children be connected to their lived experiences. These youth showed us that they really know way more compared to what their teachers and adults around them, the parents and the educators in non-formal settings, thought they know about. But at the end of the day, their repertoires of actors and actions were limited. So education needs to go beyond their lived experiences and expose them to a more tangible alternative to tackle and address these social conflicts. We just in the focus groups realized that if we give an inch to these students, we give them the space to talk about, to have this participatory dialogue and collective sharing of ideas, they would fly a mile and they would come with these brilliant ideas that really start to tackle the root causes of violence.
Thank you so much, Najmi. So we are coming towards the end of our time together, and I want to ensure that we do end on time, although I do want to turn our panelists' attention to the Q&A. If there's anything that that you would like to be willing to respond to. We have a comment from Richard Boateng and a question from Kathy Bickmore. So please go ahead and feel free to type in your responses there. I think that's actually open after the fact as well. But at this point, I will invite our lead editors, Ruth Naylor, Julia Dykem, our editor-in-chief, Dana Burde, please turn on your cameras, and as well as our panelists, the authors. Thank you so much for the tremendous amount of work. Panelists, please turn on your cameras as well. The work that went into this research, the work that went into writing and revising these articles and ensuring that we can put the spotlight on this evidence. We're thrilled to be able to do so. Thank you Zora Lakhani for representing JEiE, Global Affairs Canada, and the funding to support this incredibly important evidence and making sure that we're able to make these recommendations and push this conversation forward. Thank you to our colleagues at INEE and NYU Steinhardt, the International Education Program, where the Journal on Education in Emergencies is hosted. It's really a pleasure to do this work. And I also want to say thank you to Nate and to Emily, our colleagues at the Journal, and to Lauren and to Rebecca, our captioner. We're just so thankful for the tremendous community that comes together to make this possible. So again, the presentation is recorded. This webinar is recorded. It will be available on INEE's website. Those of you that have attended today, you'll receive the presentations as well as the recording. Thank you for being a part of this event. And we look forward to continuing to engage in this work with you and push forward this conversation. So thank you, everyone. And that ends our time together today, unless Dana, you would like to add on anything.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess you can probably hear me.
So thank you, everyone, and goodbye for now.